Welcome to the Deep Dive. We cut through the noise, pull insights from a whole stack of sources, and bring them straight to you. Today, we're really getting into something that sounds, well, almost like a political thriller, but it's reportedly happening. We're looking at former U.S. President Donald Trump's alleged role in brokering an Israel-Iran ceasefire. Yes, you heard that correctly. An Israel-Iran ceasefire. And the talk is he used a strategy similar to what he attempted with India and Pakistan. So our mission today is to unpack this pretty fascinating development. We want to understand what it might mean for global diplomacy, and explore the surprising stuff behind this unexpected news. We'll dig into the background, the alleged how, and what the ripple effects could be. Okay, so first things first. To really get why this reported ceasefire is such a big deal, we need to understand the landscape. The Israel-Iran situation, it's not new. We're talking long, complicated, deeply rooted tensions. It plays out in proxy wars, Syria, Lebanon, plus cyber attacks, shadowy operations, assassinations. It's intense.
It really is.
Yeah.
And Iran backs groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, which, from Israel's perspective, are absolutely existential threat.
Right. And Israel has always shown it's willing to strike back and strike back hard, even outside its borders, if it feels threatened. But just recently, this kind of Cold War, it really heated up. We saw direct missile strikes, open threats. There was a genuine fear it could spiral into a much wider war across the Middle East.
Absolutely. That escalation was significant.
So understanding that level of tension, that recent peak, is, well, it's critical to understanding why any pause, any ceasefire at all, feels so unexpected.
That's a crucial point. What's really fascinating here is just how entrenched these rivalries are.
Yeah.
We're talking decades of deep animosity, a real zero-sum game mentality, where if one side gains anything, the other sees it as a direct loss, a threat.
Yeah.
And this deep-seated distrust, plus the constant pattern of escalation, it just makes any pause seem almost impossible through the normal diplomatic routes. The recent direct conflict, that wasn't just another minor clash, it was a major shift. It brought them closer to, frankly, full-scale war than they've been in a long, long time.
So for a ceasefire, even if it's just temporary, to pop up in that kind of environment, it really goes against all the established patterns, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It defies the recent trajectory. You have to ask, has anything like this, outside formal channels, ever really worked before, even for a short while, given that history?
Well, that's exactly why this story is grabbing headlines. Just when everyone was kind of bracing for more fighting, maybe a long escalation, this wild card appears: Donald Trump. Former president, known for his, let's say, brash diplomacy, his very unconventional style.
Unconventional is one word for it.
And he reportedly steps in, behind the scenes. And here's where it gets really interesting, connecting back to his past actions. He apparently used a strategy some are calling his India-Pakistan playbook.
Ah, right. The 2019 situation.
Exactly. For anyone who doesn't quite recall, think back to 2019. India and Pakistan were in a really tense standoff over Kashmir, extremely volatile.
Very much so.
And Trump, president at the time, he makes global news by just offering to mediate. Just throws it out there. It definitely raised eyebrows. It was so unexpected. But he positioned himself as the ultimate deal maker, aiming to cool things down, but also kind of in his signature way, keeping both sides guessing.
Yeah, keeping them off balance.
That specific offer didn't actually lead to a major breakthrough back then, but it definitely showed his very personalized, non-traditional way of tackling these huge international crises.
Indeed. And what really stands out, I think, is how that approach fundamentally challenges the norms, the established ways of doing international mediation.
How so?
Well, usually these incredibly high-stakes talks are handled by, current leaders, experienced diplomats, international bodies like the UN. They rely on official state channels, established protocols, a certain way of doing things.
Right, the formal process.
Exactly. So the idea of a former leader, essentially a non-state actor, now stepping into something as incredibly sensitive and entrenched as the Israel-Iran conflict, it mirrors that India-Pakistan situation precisely because it's happening completely outside that traditional diplomatic framework. It really highlights how sometimes personal influence, maybe an unconventional negotiating style, can bypass, or at least try to bypass, the very structures that usually manage global conflicts.
So what are the pros and cons of that, do you think, compared to, say, the UN getting involved or multiple countries working together?
Well, the potential advantage maybe is speed, agility. bypassing bureaucracy.
That seems to be what the sources are suggesting. Yeah, that
Yeah.
unpredictability and moving fast. So if this is really what went down, what did Trump actually do? The details are still emerging. Naturally, we're piecing it together from insider accounts.
Always tricky with back channels.
Very. But reportedly, Trump used his significant post-presidency clout. He tapped into his existing networks, backchannels, personal connections.
And these weren't just minor connections, presumably.
No, apparently quite extensive. We're talking Gulf leaders, Israeli elites, and maybe even, surprisingly, some feelers out to players in Tehran's sort of outer circles.
Outer circles. Interesting phrasing.
Yeah, the sources are a bit vague there, as you'd expect. But they suggest he didn't just, make a few calls. He might have activated specific political chits.
Favors owed.
Exactly. Favors build up over years, maybe even going back to his business dealings, especially with Gulf leaders. And there are reports he might have reached out to former intermediaries, maybe business figures who have quiet ties into Tehran's less visible power structures, people who could act as trusted, unofficial messengers.
Plausible deniability built in.
Precisely. And the alleged strategy seems to have been two-pronged. Some reports say he worked closely with allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to put pressure on Iran. At the same time, he was apparently nudging Israel through his allies, people on the right-leaning side within the Knesset, Israel's parliament, and maybe even the IDF, the military.
So squeezing from both sides, using different networks.
That seems to be the idea. And the immediate result, this sudden ceasefire. Look, it wasn't presented as perfect or permanent, but it was a real pause in the fighting that honestly nobody saw coming, especially after how hot things had gotten.
No, it really wasn't on the cards.
So the big question hangs there. Did Trump actually pull off a backdoor mediation deal? Maybe even force a ceasefire, like he once tried with India and Pakistan? Based on what's leaking out, it's looking that way.
Right. And the very nature of these kinds of back channel operations means concrete details are often deliberately fuzzy, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Unlike formal diplomacy, you don't get press conferences detailing every step, no public records. We're often left trying to piece together fragments from sources, and those sources themselves might only have part of the picture. It makes it incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible, to verify every single alleged move.
Yeah, you rely on whispers and hints.
Which really raises a crucial question, I think, about power and influence today. In global affairs, how effective are these unofficial levers, these personal networks, especially when you compare them to formal state-to-state negotiations?
And can they actually build anything lasting?
Exactly. What kind of long-term stability can they genuinely create?
That really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And knowing Trump, you assume there's a strategy. He doesn't tend to do things randomly.
Not typically, no.
So let's talk motivations.
Yeah.
Why would he get involved in this? The sources are pointing to a few possibilities, and each one has its own sort of strategic logic.
Okay.
First, the obvious one, politics. He's clearly eyeing a potential 2024 run, brokering a huge deal like an Israel-Iran ceasefire. That would massively boost his image as a global deal maker.
A man who gets things done narrative.
Precisely. Someone who delivers results when maybe traditional diplomacy seems stuck. That's a powerful story for a campaign.
Yeah.
Second possibility, contrasting himself with the current administration. He might see Biden's Middle East policies as weak or ineffective in his view. Stepping in like this lets him directly contrast his style, this power diplomacy, with what he'd likely call quiet diplomacy. It positions him as the decisive leader.
Setting himself apart.
Yeah. And third, maybe it's just a genuine belief in his method, this power diplomacy idea. It's his brand, right? Direct, sometimes confrontational, using leverage and personal relationships rather than the slow, careful steps of traditional diplomacy.
Force of will over process.
Exactly. And by stepping in precisely where the established channels seem to be failing, he doesn't just grab headlines, he gets to reshape his public image as the guy who can actually, stop wars.
And it's worth thinking about the different philosophies clashing here.
Yeah.
This power diplomacy you mentioned, it really prioritizes direct leverage, personal ties, that element of surprise maybe to force an outcome.
Right.
Its strength, perhaps, is cutting through the red tape, maybe getting quicker results in some cases.
Like ripping off a Band-Aid. Maybe, but then you have quiet diplomacy. It's slower, yes, but it often focuses on building trust, taking small steps, carefully coordinating lots of different players to build something more sustainable.
More groundwork, less trauma.
Less drama, potentially more durability. So these motivations, whether they succeed long-term or not, they clearly connect to the immediate result here, a temporary ceasefire.
Which is still significant.
Undeniably. But whether that outcome holds or if it's just a short-term fix, that's the real test of this unconventional approach. Some people would argue that relying on these informal, kind of opaque networks, even if they work for a moment, they might actually undermine the institutions, the formal structures that are designed for long-term peace. What's your feeling on that trade-off?
It's a tough one. It almost feels like, in a chess game, you expect a certain move, and suddenly your opponent does something completely unexpected, uses a piece you weren't even watching.
Throws the game plan out.
Yep. Exactly. That's the kind of shock value here. And if this ceasefire actually holds, even for a while, it might really signal a major shift in how international diplomacy works. Could we be heading into a new era? One where these informal players, ex-leaders, maybe tech billionaires, who knows, even celebrities, start playing much bigger roles in trying to make peace.
It's an intriguing thought.
It is. It offers maybe more flexibility, fresh ideas outside the sometimes rigid structures of statecraft.
But there's always a but.
There's always a but. We have to immediately bring in the serious concerns the sources are raising too. How sustainable are these kinds of back-channel deals in the long run? Can they really build lasting peace, or are they just, putting a lid on things temporarily?
Patching over cracks.
Yeah. And what happens if this private diplomacy accidentally trips up official government efforts? Does it create confusion, mixed signals? Does it make future formal negotiations harder?
There's a critical question.
So yeah, what does this really mean for the future of how wars get stopped? Or maybe even how they get started?
It absolutely raises that fundamental question about power and accountability, doesn't it? When private citizens, even very powerful former leaders, step into roles usually reserved for states.
Right. Who are they accountable to?
Exactly. While getting the guns to go silent, even temporarily, is clearly a positive thing, the lack of transparency that often comes with these unofficial deals, well, it can breed instability. It can set precedents that bypass the institutions we've built, like the UN or established diplomatic corps. And it could potentially mess up a country's long-term foreign policy goals if different actors are sending different signals.
Creates chaos.
It could. You risk conflicting agendas, the lack of a single unified approach that's been publicly debated and agreed upon. So looking at this specific case, what really stands out to you when you think about the long-term fallout of this kind of freelance diplomacy is that immediate pause in fighting worth the potential risk of messing up the broader system of international relations?
It's the core dilemma, isn't it? Only time is going to tell if this ceasefire holds up, and maybe more importantly, what the hidden costs were. What diplomatic capital was spent, what geopolitical shifts happened quietly behind the scenes.
We might never fully know.
We might not. Is this the start of a new era of freelance diplomacy, where powerful individuals fill the gaps left by traditional statecraft? Or is it just a one-off? A blip on the radar caused by a unique mix of personalities and a very specific crisis moment in a conflict that seems, well, never-ending. So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. What responsibility do these non-state actors actually bear when they wade into these incredibly high-stakes international situations? Think about that balance. The pull towards making an immediate positive impact versus the potential long-term consequences for global stability, for the rule of law between nations. We really hope this deep dive gave you some food for thought. Thanks so much for joining us, and please keep digging into these complex issues with that vital curiosity.